Hello there and welcome to Into the Music on RN. I'm Gretchen Miller, bringing you the first in our landmark 6-part series on alternative rock music in the 90s. It's called Love in the 90s and it's written and produced by author, broadcaster and former Triple J presenter Craig Shufton. Over the coming weeks, Craig will take us in his vibrant and enthusiastic way through every aspect of music in the 1990s, from the collapse of borders of every kind, both musical and political, to how musicians were keeping it real. But let's start by going back to where it all began, Britain. If you think about British music back then, you'll probably call to mind names like the Stone Roses, the Happy Mondays and Primal Scream, or maybe some of the more obscure hits of that time, songs by Jesus Jones or the Soup Dragons or Lush. And if you cast your mind back to what was going on in the wider world, you'll find yourself thinking of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, or the resignation of Margaret Thatcher, or the First Gulf War. We've gotten used to seeing, say, the politics of the 60s and 70s reflected in genres like folk or disco. But what, if anything, does the early 90s rock dance crossover sound have to tell us about what was going on in the early 90s? Well, Craig Shufton's been thinking about this a lot. In this first episode of Love in the 90s, Craig takes us back to a time when borders of every kind seemed to be collapsing all round, to whatever rule it was that said indie bands couldn't make dance music or appear on Top of the Pops.
What happened when alternative music first came out was authentic. It was a reflection of what was happening at the time, and it had to do with authenticity. So
this is the reflection of the authenticity now. We're in the reflection of it.
Music means time.
The 1990s were...
It's an alternative.
Love. 90s.
Right.
An alternative history of alternative rock.
This is a story about unpopular music and what happens to it when it becomes popular. It's about a handful of underground or alternative bands from Britain and America in the early 90s who suddenly found themselves in places where those kind of bands were not normally supposed to be. On commercial radio, on national TV, standing on stage in concert halls and stadiums in front of thousands of people. I want to talk to you about why and how they ended up there, about the changes in the world that allowed this unpopular music to become popular, and about how the music in turn changed the world. Because this isn't just a story about singers and songs, it's about music in context, music as a reflector and a motor, a mirror and a dynamo. So, for example, before I tell you the story of the Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses, I want to talk to you a little bit first about Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Britain from 1979 to 1990. Because when musicians list their influences in interviews, as we sometimes ask them to do, they tend to leave out some of the most important ones. In fact, I think sometimes the things they claim to hate are much more important for our purposes than the things they say they love.
11 years ago, we rescued Britain from the parlous state to its socialist. Mr. Speaker, over the last decade, we have given power back to the people on an unprecedented scale.
Now, when Margaret Thatcher talked about giving power back to people, as she's doing here, she meant a particular kind of power, the power to choose. She believed that free choice and competition would speed Britain's economic recovery. And so she set about dismantling and selling off government utilities and drastically curbing the power of trade unions over the course of her 11 years in power. This saved her government a lot of money and it gave business a much freer hand. And so a lot of people did very well out of Thatcherism. But by the dawn of the 90s, the social cost of the 80s boom could no longer be ignored.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979?
These particular points and let us know where pushing large numbers of people into cardboard boxes and taking power away from them is somehow giving power back to them.
What about the underclass?
In a US television interview with Christopher Hitchens early in 1990, author and political commentator Richard Critchfield explained Thatcher's legacy for his American viewers.
I would say Mrs. Thatcher has one
major flaw as a political leader. She is utterly lacking in compassion or imagination when it comes to people who don't have much, say the lower half of the society. The workers, the people that haven't adjusted, are really being left out of British society. And you travel around the north, you find a large minority of Britain who are an underclass and are confined to these ghastly, what we don't have in our country. All around the northern British cities, there are vast housing projects. And now they're way out of the city, they're trapped, most of them jobless, a lot of them are drugs, a lot of crime. It's a terrible, terrible problem that British face.
Well, I would give you a description of the misspent youth of Sean William Ryder and the Happy Mondays in Salford near Manchester, but I think Critchfield just summed it up. Ghastly housing projects way out of the city, joblessness, drugs, crime. I suppose the only thing to add to that would be the boredom, that special kind of post-industrial boredom that, for some reason, provides the perfect petri dish for weird new forms of rock and roll.
Because there's nothing else to do, you know. I know it sounds corny and everything, and not this and
I know.
You've got to do something. We just did it because we, you know, not because we wanted to be famous. There was nothing else to do, and we enjoyed doing it. It was just like a little breather at the end of the day. Yeah, you know, relax, escape sort of thing. But it's like where we was brought up in Salford, right? It's sort of the main sort of music in the club scene was all Northern Soul. You know, it was like where everyone used to go in, you know, in the early 70s, lots of speed and dance all night, Wigan Pier sort of gear, all the Tamla Motown and all the sort of, so then at the same time in the early 70s you had all the funkadelic sort of stuff going, then you had your Roxy and your Bowie, and you know, our older brothers and cousins was into Jimi Hendrix and Beatles and all sorts of mad things, you know, Captain Beefheart, we'd hear all that sort of thing off the older ones, and being young, you know what I mean, we liked it all, you know, and all that sort of music.
So it all came out as a...
Well, it came out as our own, we sort of fed it into us without knowing. All them sort of influences was there.
What the Happy Mondays made of all these influences was and remains very difficult to describe. It was noisy and chaotic, but you could dance to it. Sean Ryder was nobody's idea of a singer, but there was something weirdly compelling about his shouted scraps of Salford slang.
Not everyone knows our slang. We have untold different words and names for things, you know, normal things, and we just use them in our songs because that was how we spoke anyway.
So now you're rising up to know that fluff need a jump. Go a bite out of here.
It didn't make any sense, but it did have a lot of integrity, I guess because it was a noise made to please nobody but the 5 people in the room making the noise.
We never really do anything for other people. We probably be just double selfish. We do it for ourselves all the time, you know. But it's like, you know, we never think like we're going to one day release a record and it's going to jump in straight at number 10.
And really, why would they? There was no chance of the Happy Mondays troubling the top 10 in 1985, because the top 10 in 1985 sounded like this. There was always the indie scene, the network of small labels, shops and clubs that provided a home, in theory, to oddball regional bands like the Happy Mondays. But the Mondays didn't really fit in the indie world either, basically because they were too much fun. They were essentially a party band.
A sort of party atmosphere.
And partying was taboo in the world of indie rock. Dance music, funk, all of this stuff was associated with yuppie, consumerist lifestyles and Thatcherite self-interest. And the indie scene defined itself in stark opposition to all of this. It wasn't that indie bands were expected to write protest songs all the time, exactly, but they were expected to honestly reflect something about the state of affairs in Britain in the 1980s. The Happy Mondays music, by contrast, was all about escapism.
Relax, escape sort of thing.
So it was kind of hard for indie rock fans and critics to take them seriously. When local legend Tony Wilson signed the band to his label, Factory Records, in 1986, it seemed like a weird thing to do, and just another of Wilson's infamous non-career decisions. Just another intriguing but ultimately doomed act whose brief career would be kept alive by the sales of New Order albums.
But suddenly, with the new work they're doing now, which brings various modern cultures colliding together, you realize that everyone in the company who wanted to work with them was right. It flowers now 2-3 years later. But what we saw 3 years ago, was the germ that was going to sprout into what we have now, of which we're very proud.
It could be that Tony Wilson was somehow blessed with the ability to see through time and space and into the future, but it could also be that he just got lucky enough to have signed the Happy Mondays just prior to the arrival in Britain of the drugs that made it possible for awkward indie rock people to dance to their music without feeling guilty about it. And when this happened, everything changed for the Happy Mondays.
Friends are dancing, that kind of thing.
I've just read about it in the newspapers that acid house music, I assumed it was something to do with the drug scene.
It must affect the brain in some way. Unless it's just the music that does it. I presume they do friends are dancing, that kind of thing. Probably out of control, not behaving like normally they would, because they're under the effect of the drug.
These Daily Mail readers, interviewed by the BBC in 1989, were on the right track. Acid house was about drugs and music. The sound was techno and house. The stimulant of choice was MDMA or ecstasy.
E for England.
Estranged for most of the 80s, ecstasy helped guitars and beats to get it back together again. Within a year of the drug's arrival, barriers between scenes and styles had begun to dissolve and disappear.
All those are just labels. We know that music is music.
Gig unites the experience of going to a rave with the spirit of rock and roll.
Smiths fans started going to raves and nightclubs. Guitar bands started making records for the dance floor instead of the pub, inviting DJs to remix their songs. So the sound was right, the drugs were right, and suddenly the Happy Mondays nonsense made perfect sense. By 1990, the band had records in both the indie charts and the national pop top 40.
Stars of the charts and the underground. Happy Monday.
This unexpected success gave Ryder and the band the means to get out of where they were from. When it came time to record album number 3, they decamped to LA.
Why not? I don't know.
Where they soaked up the sunshine and embraced the good life with a vengeance.
We wanted to go to Jamaica, didn't we?
No Barbados.
No Barbados, but we ended up here.
Weirdly, it was at exactly this point that everyone else decided to go to Manchester.
Manchester this, Manchester that.
We've been led to believe that Manchester is the centre of the known universe.
Looking for the next big thing in pop music? You may need to look no further than Manchester, England.
The idea that Manchester could produce great bands was not news exactly. The city was, after all, home to the Buzzcocks, Joy Division, New Order, the Smiths, and a host of other less well-known talents. But the simultaneous success of a half-dozen relatively new Mancunian groups, along with the city's growing reputation as a party destination, encouraged the idea that Manchester was an epicentre for what the music press was starting to call the indie dance crossover.
I think all of this came about because in England there's a programme called Top of the Pops, and the 3 Manchester groups were in the charts on Top of the Pops all on the same night, and everyone went, wow, what's happening in Manchester?
There was talk of a scene and even a movement. And Tony Wilson was more than happy to confirm that the revolution was underway.
We all wondered, how are we going to have another movement in Britain? Because the designer magazines and the trendy magazines and the trendy television picks every new thing up and tells you this is the new trend. So it's all empty. This trend came from the streets. It was the only way something could be original. And they don't like it very much because they're yobs, it upsets them. But that's where it comes from, and that's why it's vibrant, and that's why it's the hottest thing that has happened in this country since 1976.
It was true that a lot of London journalists looked down their noses a bit at the Mondays. Even if they liked the group, their praise sometimes took a slightly patronising tone. You got a sense sometimes that the Mondays were being presented as anthropological specimens, noble savages of the council estate.
What sort of image do you think that you've got? How do you think people see you?
Well, we know how people see us, but we're not really like that, you know what I mean?
How do people see you then?
I don't know, sort of as a hooligan. The press do anyway, no one else does.
The This image that Wilson spins here of well-heeled London snobs cowering in fright from some kind of working-class uprising from the north was mostly a confection, designed specifically to appeal to another group of journalists who worked for Britain's two competing weekly music papers.
Things like this, the New Musical Express.
And it's fair to say it worked a treat.
We have gone a little bit bonkers, shall we say, over the Manchester bands, but then that is the role of the music press, isn't it, to go bonkers over certain things that come our way.
These writers were mostly veterans of the punk and post-punk era, and the experience had given them a taste for the idea of pop as a form of working-class expression, if not working-class revolt. And in this sense, the Happy Mondays were all their wildest dreams come true.
This trend came from the street.
And since the group's popularity peaked at the same time as Margaret Thatcher's plummeted, well, the story basically wrote itself. At least it would have if Shaun Ryder hadn't proved to be such a profound disappointment as a protest singer and an even bigger letdown as a working-class hero.
It's like when people say, why don't you write political songs and why don't you talk more about politics, right? You know what I mean? But like where we was coming from is you don't want to go out at night time or you don't want to buy records listening to someone rambling on about how bad the housing is and how bad the unemployment is and all that sort of thing. You want to make good time music and things, you know, that make you escape from things.
Just what is it that you want to do?
Well, we want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do. And we want to get loaded. And we want to have a good time.
It's interesting to compare the Mondays at this point with another indie group of the early 90s, Primal Scream. Like Shaun Ryder, Scream singer Bobby Gillespie was born in the early 60s to a working-class family. His band was signed to an indie label for most of the 80s, but Gillespie eventually reacted against the indie scene's narrow-minded aesthetic.
You like a certain kind of band with a certain kind of haircut.
In particular, this taboo on hedonism and dancing.
I think you just got to have a good time all the time, if possible.
Just like the Mondays, Primal Scream found themselves in just the right place at the right time when acid house hit. They overhauled their sound with the help of their friend, DJ Andrew Weatherall.
Yeah, but I've just done a remix.
And scored the previously unthinkable trifecta of having hits in clubland, rave reviews in the indie press, and songs in the national chart. When the band appeared on Top of the Pops, it seemed like some kind of revolt from below was underway.
Oh, really good.
I was under the impression you were going to trash the studio.
Nah, that would have been silly, wouldn't it? It's as pointless as trashing a hotel room, you know? If you're going to be violent, then I think you should channel your violence in the right direction. And I think the right direction is, people that break up strikes, people that cannot destroy the health service. I think it's much more constructive to hit a policeman with a brick or attack certain politicians.
Well, no prizes for guessing who Gillespie means by certain politicians. The singer is shaking a fist in Margaret Thatcher's direction and specifically throwing his support behind the poll tax riot, a violent demonstration in London against an unpopular piece of legislation widely seen as key to Thatcher's eventual downfall.
Because there was a transfer of resources from the poor to the wealthy. That's why the poll tax was unacceptable, and it's because of the poll tax she has fallen.
Shaun Ryder, by contrast, went out of his way to denounce the rioters the following month. He suggested that the protesters smashing up expensive cars on the evening news had done this because they were jealous, and compared them to the Mondays fans who turned their back on the group because they were making money and partying in LA. "I'm truly sorry for the people still stuck in the shit," he said, "but I can hardly take the whole of working class Salford with me, can I?" Back in 1990, it seemed like these two groups were speaking the same language. Primal Scream's Loaded and the Happy Mondays' Loose Fit were both indie dance anthems, both built on laid-back shuffling grooves, both with big gospel choruses, both largely concerned with personal freedom, doing what you want.
Do what you're doing, say what you're saying, go where you're going, think what you think, it sounds good to me.
Well, we want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do.
But where for Primal Scream freedom meant revolution, for the Mondays it meant the freedom to earn as much money as you like and spend it however you like. The freedom's guaranteed by the system that Gillespie hoped to destroy.
A lot of people say that New Order became really acceptable and really like yuppie band. What do you think of that?
No, yuppies is it? Join them.
Everyone likes to be a yuppie.
I've heard people say that the 90s was an important decade for rock music because back then the music was more authentic, more real.
What happened when alternative music first came out was authentic. It was a reflection of what was happening in the time, and it had to do with authenticity.
But I think the only reason this idea has got around is because bands in the 90s spent so much time fretting over their realness, and critics spent so much time discussing it. I think that the decade was defined more by a kind of authenticity crash. Realness became hyperinflated and, as a result, valueless.
That's hard to explain. There just doesn't seem to be any room to be real.
And I think the reason this happened is because during the 90s, as we'll see in the coming weeks, the underground was absorbed by, or became otherwise indistinguishable from, the mainstream.
Alternative. It's like alternative to what?
In the 80s, it might have been possible, as an indie band, to define yourself in opposition by the things that you refuse to do, the greedy and dishonest industry that you refuse to get involved in. But in the early 90s, this distinction began to disappear.
They'll take advantage on you if you're on an indie, and they'll take advantage of you if you're on a major, so you might as well get
Damned
the
if you
distribution.
do, damned if you don't.
So we sold out, big deal.
I really don't know what the definition of selling out is anymore.
And in England, the groundwork for this was done mostly by two bands, the Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses.
You don't see the difference between independent and majors. They're all into making money, aren't they? That's what it's about. They all hire pluggers, they all go through the business. And your music doesn't change just because so-and-so's paying for your tape instead of, you know, Squirrel Records.
The Stone Roses, Manchester's other favourite sons, were formed in 1983 and released their debut album 6 years later. Despite the coincidence of their arrival and their accents, the Roses had very little in common, musically speaking, with the Mondays. They went for tunes over grooves, and their temperament was more serious and earnest.
Not enough time for negative thinking. Positive thinking brings its own rewards.
Today there's some debate as to the merits of their relatively small output, but in 1989 the Stone Roses were a sensation.
Stone Roses on the cover. Stone Roses on the cover again.
Hailed in England as the best band in the world, usually by themselves.
You all say that you expect to be the best band in the world, so...
No, we know that we are. We don't expect anyone else to think anything in particular about us. No, I've always had self-belief. We always believed in what we were doing, and we always knew that it'd come through in the end.
In 1989, no one had ever heard anything like this coming out of the mouth of an indie rock singer. Back then, the fashionable thing to do was to stare at your shoes and appear reticent and humble, which let the world know that you are artistically pure and not in it for the fame. It wasn't cool for indie bands to seem ambitious. Ambition itself was badly tainted by association with Thatcherite greed. But Stone Roses singer Ian Brown believed that the quality of his band's music ensured its popular success. All he had to do was wait.
Well, if you're the best band in the world, why aren't you number one?
It takes time for people to fall in love with you. But it's inevitable. Because there's nothing else about. And people have got good taste.
In 1990, the band's future looked very bright indeed. The only thing standing in their way was the past.
Has anyone ever said anything about the band that really, really hurts?
That were influenced by the 60s.
But first, another rock and roll event remembered 20 years later, Woodstock.
There were a lot of anniversaries in 1989.
Woodstock, 20 years ago today. A steady stream of...
In a way, it marked the beginning of those now notorious 20-year nostalgia cycles, complete with anniversary TV specials and reunion tours. In both the mainstream and the underground, there was a sort of re-engagement with the sounds and styles, the themes and concerns of the 1960s.
Manchester pop is more than just a sound, it's also a lifestyle, a distinct subculture with its own ways of dressing up, getting high, and most notably, dancing. Somehow it all seems, well, sort of 60s.
What we've done is like created the 90s interpretation of the hippie scene, you know, a more modernist view to it, but the basic structure's still there and it does come from there, you know.
Five Rolling Stones covers charted in the UK between 1989 and 1990. The year's most popular haircut was a kind of grown-out Beatles mop top. The universal symbols of cultural relevance were the cartoon daisy and the peace sign. Primal Scream covered Rocky Erickson and sampled Sly Stone and the Rolling Stones. They even invited legendary Stones producer Jimmy Miller to produce 2 songs on their album, and quickly wished that they hadn't.
I mean, I don't know what it was like going to the Rolling Stones. I'm sure it was good fun.
if you were in the Rolling Stones.
The problem, in a nutshell, was that 60s music was exciting, but 60s nostalgia was an oppressive bore. It imposed a terrible double standard on the children of the 70s. On the one hand, it told them that the 60s was a special moment, never to be repeated, and that the youth music of those years would define youth music for all time.
As rock and roll is getting older and older, you know, for me, the 60s the real rock and roll, and you only can try to copy it, you know.
On the other hand, they were reminded at every opportunity that it is the prerogative, the responsibility of young people to invent their own culture and make history.
Once we get out of the 80s, the 90s are going to make the 60s look like the 50s.
Except you can't because it's already been done. But you still have to, or you'll never be as good as your parents. For Ian Brown to suggest that the Stone Roses were not influenced by the music of the 60s was a total lie. But also the expression of a very sincere wish to get history off his back. As if to prove just how serious he was about rejecting the past and embracing the future, Brown claimed to have turned down an offer from the Rolling Stones to support them on their 1989 Steel Wheels tour.
Even though he's about to turn 46 years old, Mick Jagger showed he's still ready to strut his stuff as he and the band announced a 29-city reunion tour of North America.
We don't want to warm up for the Rolling Stones in 1989. We consider ourselves more exciting at this moment in time.
In 1989, the 90s just couldn't come soon enough. Still, it's fair to say that no one was prepared for just how suddenly and conclusively the 80s would end. Reagan and Thatcher, the two political giants of the era, departed within 18 months of one another. In the meantime, the Cold War, the deadly global standoff that had shaped not just the 1980s but the entire post-war period, simply disappeared.
If you had asked me 10 years ago, is it possible that communism could collapse, by the year 1992, not only communism but the Soviet Union itself, I would have said absolutely ridiculous, And that's one of the wonderful things about the world right now, is that all of these developments are happening that nobody really anticipated.
To get a sense of the way audiences would have heard and understood songs like She Bangs the Drums, Hallelujah, Loose Fit, Loaded, Come Together, and Unbelievable in 1990, I think it's important to keep in mind that all of this had just happened. None of these songs was written specifically with the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Europe in mind. But this singularly peaceful revolution and the great global merging it promised lent them a considerable extra weight, legitimised their otherwise rhetorical demands for freedom and unity. And the fall of communism did actually inspire a couple of songs, including this one of the best-known hits of 1990 by a band nobody ever talks about anymore, Jesus Jones. The band's singer, Mike Edwards, came up with the idea for the lyrics shortly after the Berlin Wall came down and fleshed it out on a trip to post-revolutionary Romania. The finished song described a world changed in the blink of an eye. The last line in the chorus evokes the title of Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, in which Fukuyama argues that the collapse of the Soviet bloc might indicate that Western liberal democracy is the final form of human government. There could be no doubt that the end of the Cold War was good news for the oppressed people of countries like East Germany, Hungary, and Romania. It was also very good news for proponents of the free market and laissez-faire capitalism in America and Britain, who had long since successfully conflated freedom of movement and expression with the freedom to earn and spend. Margaret Thatcher, who declared socialism a failure back in 1979, wasted no time scoring points.
I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs.
In 1990, to side with the left was to side with the oppressors and against the oppressed, and Thatcher knew it. Who would defend socialism in the face of all those happy hordes pouring across the border from east to west? Didn't they all want freedom?
Just what is it that you want to do? Well, we want to be free.
In a curious way, this was part of the sense of joy and relief of that particular moment in music history. The feeling that everybody wanted the same thing, more or less. The new music demanded freedom, liberty of movement, self-determination, and the elevation of individual needs over societal constraints. And this, as the leaders of the free world insisted, was what the events of 1989 were all about.
We're beginning a new era, an age of freedom, a time of peace for all peoples.
Good morning. It's a busy morning at Fort Bragg this morning and on.
Toward the end of 1990, in a recording studio in LA, Shawn Ryder scribbled down some lyrics for a new tune called Loose Fit. He'd been watching TV news reports of the Gulf War, which had begun 3 weeks earlier when the US launched an offensive mission against Iraq's president, Saddam Hussein. Ryder mixed up some images from the TV coverage with a few lines from his personal manifesto, versions of which he'd been rehearsing in interviews over the past few months.
Do what you do, spend what you owe, pay what you pay, look where you're going, say what you're thinking, kill who you're killing, sing if you're singing, speak if you're speaking, sounds good to me.
It was a loose fit, but a good one. The singer's song and the president's war shared a common goal: freedom by whatever means necessary.
But if history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms.
Craig Shufton there with the first in his series Love in the 90s. And more from Craig next week when he explores how alternative bands cracked the mainstream. And if you feel like rolling around and totally covering yourself in the 90s some more, just head to our website for full interviews you heard snippets of today and lots more links, plus extra